All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Gonna get right into the book here. Nuclear Rivalry in the Cold War, 1950 to 1957. On page 964, second paragraph down. I think I got it this time. The method pursued to achieve a thermonuclear explosion up to June 1951 by fusing tritium and deuterium into helium was possible as a scientific experiment and was achieved at the beautiful atoll of Ain-Withok in April 1951. But this method cannot be used for a bomb since the whole mechanism had to be enclosed in a complex refrigerator the size of a small house. The problem of the bomb was to get the hydrogen isotope particles close enough together so that they would fuse. This could be done at the almost unobtainable temperatures over 400 million degrees. It could be done at lower temperatures if the particles were already close together, as they would be when they were very cold. As hydrogen gets colder, it liquefies at negative 423 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, but it is very difficult to keep it that cold. It can be kept at the temperature of liquid air, negative 414 degrees Fahrenheit, by immersing it in this, but at that temperature, 9 degrees higher than its own vaporizing point, hydrogen will stay liquid only if it is under pressure of about 2,700 pounds per square inch. The successful hydrogen fusion at Ain-Withok in April 1951 was achieved with a very small quantity of tritium and deuterium held at these fantastic conditions, then suddenly exposed to the 100 million degree blast of an exploding A-bomb. The additional energy released by the fusing hydrogen was so small that it was not noticeable to eyewitnesses, but it could be inferred that the electromagnetic recording apparatus, Thus, it would be a mistake to call this explosion, known as Operation Greenhouse, an H-bomb. As the AEC would say, it was a thermonuclear device. The successful way to the thermonuclear bomb emerged from a suggestion made to Teller in February 1951 by a brilliant young Polish mathematician, Stanisław Ulam. Teller presented the idea as developed by himself and his assistant Frederick D. Hoffman to a meeting of the GAC held at the Institute for Advanced Study on June 19th to 20th, 1951. Everyone present realized that the problem was solved. As Oppenheimer said, it was sweet. Briefly, the idea was to merge the two separate operations of making tritium out of lithium and fusing the tritium with deuterium into a single operation as a bomb. The feasibility of this new plan was tested in a successful thermonuclear explosion called Mike. As part of the test of operations Ivy at Ain-Withok on November 1st, 1952. This produced a blast equal to about 10 million tons of TNT, creating a fireball 3.5 miles wide, whose heat was felt 30 miles away and which completely destroyed the small isolate on which it occurred, leaving a hole in the lagoon 175 feet deep and a mile wide. But this was not a bomb, since the mechanism weighed 65 tons and filled a cubical box 25 feet on each edge. The great significance of the thermonuclear bomb was that, unlike the A-bomb, it could be made of limitless power. An A-bomb explosion was measured in thousands of tons of TNT, kilotons, and could be made up to a few hundred kilotons in power. The thermonuclear bomb had to be measured in millions of tons of TNT, megatons, and had no limit on its size. The world's third thermonuclear explosion was a shocker. exploded by the Russians on August 12, 1953, and revealed to the world by American atmosphere testing devices. It may have been dropped from a plane. If so, the Russians were far in advance of us, since we did not achieve a droppable bomb until May 21, 1956. In that interval, we exploded at Bikini on March 1, 1954, our first real thermonuclear bomb. It was a horrifying device, a triple-stage fission-fusion-fission bomb which spread death-dealing radioactive contamination over more than 800 square miles of the Pacific and injurious radiation all over the world. This first American thermonuclear bomb had a trigger of 2 A-bombs exploded simultaneously to detonate a second stage consisting of lithium-6 deuteride. This latter was a compound of a lithium isotope of mass 6, which makes up about 1/15 of natural lithium and has a nucleus of 3 protons with 3 neutrons, and of heavy hydrogen 2. This compound, a white crystalline substance, was surrounded with a shiny sphere of almost a ton of metallic natural uranium. The neutrons from the A-bomb trigger, blasting through the lithium deuterium crystals, split the lithium-6 into helium and tritium, hydrogen-3, in a tremendous explosion. The latter then fused with the deuterium to make helium, at the same time emitting a great shower of extra neurons, which split the surrounding natural uranium in a superatomic fission holocaust. The whole process occurred almost instantaneously with a shattering blast equal to 18 billion tons of TNT. 18 million tons of TNT. With the blast was released a vast quantity of deadly radioactive isotopes, including the dangerous strontium-90, which, like calcium, is readily absorbed into human bones, where it is deadly radiation may easily engender cancer. I think we've heard of strontium-90 before if you're a conspiracy theorist. The test of this inhuman weapon called Bravo was announced to the world by the AEC as the test of an H-bomb. It was really a U-bomb, or a fission-fusion-fission bomb, and for almost a year until February 15, 1955, its real nature was concealed by the AEC, apparently at the insistence of the new Republican chairman, Lewis L. Strauss. Secrecy from Strauss left the world with 2 mistaken ideas. One, that the successful thermonuclear bomb was simply an H-bomb, and 2, that it was accordingly made on the lines Teller had been following in 1945 to 1951. From these errors, partisan inference could conclude that our delay in achieving an H-bomb resulted from the restraints placed on Teller's work during the Truman administration. This, of course, was not believed by the atomic scientist, but seemed convincing to many well-informed persons from the strange fact that William L. Lawrence, science editor of the New York Times, spread these 2 mistaken ideas. As the best-known scientific journalist in America, Lawrence's stories were accepted as true by the ordinary well-informed public, though not by scientists. Lawrence, the only newspaper reporter allowed to see the test at Alamogordo, or the nuclear explosion on Japan, wrote a book on the H-bomb which he called The Hell Bomb in 1950. It was full of misleading ideas, forgivable at that date, but totally erroneous in following years when the book continued to be read. It started that the H-bomb would be exploded by direct fusion of deuterium and tritium, a method which it attributed to Teller. Years later, the New York Times Lawrence still insisted that the test of March 1954 was not a fission-fusion-fission FFF bomb, but was simply a fission-fusion H bomb and not a U bomb. This version of Bravo apparently originated with Strauss, who denied that Bravo was a U bomb and explained the surprisingly large, noxious fallout as a consequence of irradiation of the coral reef on which the bomb exploded. This story entrenched in the public mind that Teller was the father of the H-bomb, that he had been held back to the injury of American security by Soviet sympathizers during the Truman administration, and that there was some basis for the AEC condemnation of Oppenheimer as a security risk in June 1954. Behind much of this was the Air Force, allied to Teller, Lawrence, and Strauss, and very opposed to Oppenheimer. This opposition arose because of Oppenheimer's work for diversification of weapons, which was regarded by the Air Force as a treasonable diversion of both money and nuclear materials from it to the other services, and for his efforts to get smaller nuclear warheads. These latter paved the way for long-range missiles, for tactical nuclear weapons, and for the Polaris nuclear submarine, which supplanted the Air Force manned bombers, and by the middle of the 1960s, threatened to shift America's primary deterrence of Soviet aggression from the SAC to the Navy. It should be recorded that Teller had little to do with the actual making of the successful thermonuclear bomb. As usual, he was very restless and felt hampered at Los Alamos in 1951 and spent most of his time lobbying with the Air Force and the Radiation Laboratory trying to get a new second weapons laboratory of his own. To free himself for this activity, he left Los Alamos in November 1951. When the AEC refused to establish a second laboratory, Teller went to the Air Force and obtained its support for a second weapons laboratory, the so-called Livermore Laboratory, attached to E.O. Lawrence's Radiation Laboratory at Berkeley, California. This was established in July 1952. All the thermonuclear tests and the final H-bomb, which we have mentioned, were achievements of Los Alamos, whose operations, under Norris Bradbury, Teller disapproved. Teller himself was present at none of the tests of the lithium bomb, and his Livermore laboratory did not participate in the tests. None of this was, in fact, as it was built up in public opinion in the period 1951 to 1955. The public record on these matters was rectified in 1955 by Teller, by Lawrence, and by the AEC, but by that time Oppenheimer had been condemned, the Republicans were in office, and the story of subversion in the American government had become an established American myth, along with the thermonuclear bomb as a hydrogen bomb and Teller as its father. These myths were, of course, not believed by the nuclear scientist, a fact that helped to intensify the suspicion the radical right held for them and for all educated people. The truth about Bravo had been revealed to the nuclear scientists of the world, including the Russians, almost immediately after the test and in a most dramatic fashion. Shortly after the Bravo blast at Bikini, a small Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, was caught in the edge of the lethal radiations from the test. It was, indeed, a lucky dragon, for only one of the crew subsequently died, although the rest were sick for months. The vessel was 90 miles east of the blast, but it had been only 10 miles farther south, all the crew would have died horrible deaths. 2 weeks after the blast, when the doomed vessel reached Japan, Professor Kenjiro Kimura, the first discoverer of uranium-237, found this rare isotope in the fallout ash over the Lucky Dragon. The U-237 could have come only from fission of U-239. This discovery, published in Japanese in August 1954, revealed that Bravo had been a gigantic U-bomb whose deadly nature resided more in its radioactive fallout than in its heat and blast. Under the tight blanket of the secrecy of Strauss, the scientists who knew asked themselves, why did the AEC make such a dirty bomb? Why was it all kept such a secret? The answer now seems clear. The Soviet H-bomb explosion of August 1953 showed that the Russians were ahead of us in the H-bomb race. This the AEC could not publicly admit. This disadvantage had to be overcome as rapidly as possible, and the best way to do so was to shift from blast warfare to radioactivity warfare. The movement in this direction, which was fortunately only temporary, 1953 to 1956, was intensified by the early and very secret stages of the missile race. Late in 1952, immediately following the test of Mike, John von Neumann headed a committee which recommended an intensified effort to develop a long-range missile, ICBM. At that time, the American effort in missiles was restricted very largely to variations of the German V-2 weapon and to lesser rockets such as Aerobee and WAC Corporal. The new effort soon showed that longer range would be easier to achieve than greater accuracy, and that it would be very difficult to build a missile which could be depended upon to hit within 10 miles of a target. At such a distance, blast, even at 10 megatons, would do little damage, and if such targets were to be knocked out, this would have to be done by a spreading cloud of radioactive fallout and not by the blast, hence the U-bomb. The U-bomb, concealed from the public view by secrecy and by misleading statements from the AEC, usually from Strauss, remained the weapon of last resort in the American arsenal throughout the Dulles era. The launching of the first Polaris submarine in January 1954, 6 weeks before Bravo, did not change the situation. The first American test of an airdrop lithium bomb in May 1956 was a delayed fall from a B-52 jet bomber at 55,000 feet. It exploded at 15,000 feet in a 4-mile-wide fireball, but was almost an equal distance off its target. To prepare public opinion to accept use of the U-bomb, if it became necessary, Strauss sponsored a study of radioactive fallout whose conclusion was prejudged by calling it Project Sunshine. By selective release of some evidence and strict secrecy of other information, the Strauss Group tried to establish in public opinion that there was no real danger to anyone from nuclear fallout, even in an all-out nuclear war. This gave rise to a controversy between the scientists of the BAS group, led by Ralph E. Lapp, and the Eisenhower administration, led by Strauss, on the nature and danger of fallout and of nuclear warfare in general. As we shall see in a moment, the Eisenhower government, through Dulles's doctrine of mass retaliation, enunciated in January 1954, was so deeply committed to nuclear warfare that it could not permit the growth of public opinion, which would refuse to accept the use of nuclear weapons because of objections to the danger of fallout to neutrals and non-combatants. In this struggle, Strauss, Dulles, and Teller were supported by the Air Force, which feared and resented the efforts of the Oppenheimer Group to shift the defense expenditures over a much wider range than that of massive retaliation. They were particularly alarmed by the efforts of Oppenheimer, Lee DeBridge, and others to spend money on anti-air defenses. By 1953, this struggle became so intense that the supporters of the Air Force and of massive retaliation decided they must destroy the public image and public career of Oppenheimer to influence public opinion and to deter other scientists of his view from opposition to the new Republican Air Force Party line. The end of the American nuclear monopoly in late 1950 made necessary a reopening of the strategic debate which had been stabilized on the Truman Doctrine of Containment in 1947. Containment strategy was based on a strategic balance between Soviet mass armies and the American nuclear monopoly, in which each of these would deter use of the other, thus establishing an umbrella under which the United States could use its economic power to win the Cold War. The strategic balance had been established as the Truman Doctrine early in 1947 and had been followed by the containment weapon in aid to Greece and Turkey, and above all by the Marshall Plan. This policy in the years 1947 to 1950 won numerous victories for the West all along the Soviet bloc periphery, and especially in West Germany and in Japan, both of which became solidly attached to the West. The major failure, justified as inevitable in terms of the magnitude of the problem and the resources available, was the loss of China to the Soviet bloc, but this was generally accepted by the supporters of containment on the double ground that the available resources must go to Europe, and more important than China, and that China would never be a strong or dependable satellite of Russia. This doctrine of containment, by depriving each side of its strongest weapon, the Soviet mass army and the American SAC force, tended to neutralize these and forced each side into supplementary strategic plans. On the Soviet side, these new plans involved the use of nibbling tactics by its satellites. On the American side, these new plans involved the development of a balanced and flexible defensive posture based on all services and weapons. The new Soviet plan required a diversion of American aims from the Soviet Union itself to its periphery and to its satellites. They also involved keeping aggression below the level which would trigger a SAC retaliation. This level was much higher for a satellite state than for the Soviet Union itself. In fact, while almost any military aggression by the USSR might trigger an SAC nuclear strike in return, almost no aggression by a satellite, especially a lesser satellite, would do so. The areas in which such indirect adventures by the USSR might take place were obvious: the Near East and the Far East. In both of these areas, the ineptness of American policy made the Soviet task fairly easy. The American response to this shift in Soviet strategy appeared not as a response to an overt manifestation of Soviet policy, but as a response to Joe I. Moreover, it was not a Defense Department or JCS response, but was sponsored and pushed through by the policy planning staff of the State Department under Paul Nitze. It arose from the needs of NATO as a defensive force against Russia and advocated a policy very similar to that desired by Oppenheimer and the GAC, increased emphasis on a balanced defense with strengthened ground forces, including those of our allies, and rapid development of tactical nuclear weapons and a tactical Air Force role. This effort, which would have required an increase in the defense budget from the 1950 figure of $13 billion to about $35 billion, was accepted in April 1950 by the National Security Council as Directive NSC 68, but with a cost figure of only $18 billion a year. The dominant thought of the NSC 68 was the exception of a strategic nuclear stalemate was the expectation of a strategic nuclear stalemate between the United States and the USSR by 1954 and the necessity of preparing for methods of defense other than massive bombing to resist Soviet aggression. Naturally, this directive was abhorrent to the big bomber boys. The extraordinary thing is that their resistance was successful, and NSC 68 was replaced by massive retaliation and a new directive, the so called NSC 162, in October 1953. In spite of all the lessons of the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, which the Air Force and the Eisenhower administration jointly ignored. All right, the next section is the Korean War and its aftermath, 1950 to 1954. The emphasis by the American armed forces on nuclear retaliation as their chief response to communist aggression anywhere in the world made it necessary to draw a defense perimeter over which such aggressions would trigger retaliation from us. Such a boundary had been established in Europe by the military occupation forces and NATO, but at the end of 1949 was still unspecified in the Far East because of the recent victory of the communists in China. At the insistence of the military leaders, especially General MacArthur, that perimeter was drawn to exclude Korea, Formosa, and mainland China. Accordingly, all American forces had been evacuated from South Korea in June 1949. In March of that year, MacArthur publicly stated, "Our defense line runs through the chain of islands fringing the coast of Asia. It starts from the Philippines and continues through Ryukyu Archipelago, which includes its broad main bastion, Okinawa. Then it bends back through Japan and the Aleutian Island chain to Alaska." The MacArthur defense perimeter in the Far East was accepted by the Secretary of State, Aikson, in a speech on February 12, 1950, but not at all in the sense in which partisan Republicans attacked it later. Aikson specifically stated that America's guarantee was given only to areas east of that line, but the American power might be used to the west of it, where independent nations must first seek their security on their own initiative and the organized security system of the United Nations. To Aikson, therefore, the boundary was not between areas we would defend and those we would not defend, but between those we would defend unilaterally and those we would defend collectively. However, it seems clear that in private, by the end of 1949, all parts of the administration in Washington looked forward to the fall of Formosa, the complete disappearance of Chiang Kai-shek, the recognition of Red China and its admission to the United Nations as preliminaries to an intensive diplomatic effort to exploit the split between Soviet Russia and Communist China, which was regarded as inevitable. This version of Chinese Titoism never became public policy, but on October 12, 1949, after the JCS under Eisenhower voted that Formosa was not of sufficient strategic importance to warrant its occupation by American troops, the three defense departments and the Department of State agreed unanimously that Formosa would be conquered by Red China by the end of 1950. Whatever merit there may have been in our far eastern defense perimeter and its implications for Formosa, it clearly left Korea in an ambiguous position. The Soviet Union interpreted this ambiguity to mean that the United States would allow South Korea to be conquered by North Korea, just as Red China, about the same time, assumed that the United States would permit it to conquer Formosa. Instead, when Russia, through its satellite North Korea, sought to take Korea before Red China had taken Formosa, This gave rise to an American counteraction which prevented either aggressor from getting its aim. There can be little doubt that the United States, along with the rest of the world, underestimated the almost insanely aggressive nature of Red China. From 1949 onward, this newly established regime tried to bite every friendly hand which tried to lead it into the community of established nations. It made it perfectly clear to all its neighbors in Asia that its policies would be based on hatred for any country which did not break with the United States and line up with the Soviet Union. Even India, which leaned over backwards to be friendly, was upbraided almost daily in extravagant insults, of which one of the more moderate was a charge that Nehru was the running dog of British American imperialists. When Great Britain offered diplomatic recognition in January 1950, it was rebuffed. Nor was this aggressive behavior only verbal. In spite of the devastation and economic dislocation of the Civil War, Red Chinese plans for aggression continued. The general level of Chinese production in 1949 was about half what it had been in 1942, and the country clearly needed an interval to recuperate, but the budget for 1950 allotted 40% of its funds for the armed services, imposed a tax of 20% on peasants, agricultural incomes, and anticipated a deficit of nearly 20% to be covered by printing paper money. Its declared immediate plans included the conquest of Hainan Island, Formosa, and Tibet. Hainan was conquered in April 1950, and the buildup against Formosa continued for at least 2 months more. About 20,000 Koreans in the Chinese forces were detached and returned to North Korea, where they joined the armed forces of the People's Republic of Korea, PRK, that is, North Korean Communist Republic. This may have been done at Russia's request. On June 25, 1950, after a 2-hour artillery bombardment, 60,000 North Koreans, led by 100 Soviet tanks, crossed the 38th parallel and flung themselves on 90,000 lightly armed and already dispirited South Korean troops. The latter, lacking tanks, planes, or heavy artillery, reeled backwards to the south and did not stop until August 6th, when they finally made a stand before Busan in the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula. In this retreat, the ROK troops suffered 50,000 casualties in the first month. For 48 hours after the Korean attack, the world hesitated, awaiting America's reaction. On June 26, 1950, the 5th birthday of the United Nations, many feared a Munich, leading to the collapse of the whole United Nations security system at its first major challenge. Truman's reaction, however, was decisive. He immediately committed American air and sea forces in the area south of the 38th parallel and demanded a UN condemnation of the aggression. Thus, for the first time in history, a world organization voted to use collective force to stop armed aggression. This was possible because the North Korean attack occurred at a time when the Soviet delegation was absent from the United Nations Security Council, boycotting it in protest at the presence of the delegation from nationalist China. Accordingly, the much-used Soviet veto was unavailable. On June 27, 1950, the Security Council, with Yugoslavia casting the only opposing vote, condemned the aggression and asked its members to give assistance to South Korea. On the same day, President Truman ordered American forces into action and sent the United States 7th Fleet to neutralize the Formosa Strait, where the Red Chinese armies were still poised for the invasion of Formosa. This rapid response won general approval within the United States, even from those who later condemned and opposed it. One of these was Senator Taft, who prefaced his temporary approval by charging that all the troubles in the Far East arose from the Democrats' sympathetic acceptance of communism, and that the North Korean attack was in response to the invitation contained in Aiksen's speech on January 12th. Is it any wonder that the Korean Communists took us at the word given by the Secretary of State? He demanded Aiksen's immediate resignation, a cry which continued almost uninterruptedly over the next 2.5 years. The president's order for the ground forces to rescue the South Koreans was not easy to carry out. Air Force success in its budget struggles with the other services and the general budget cutting by the Republican 80th Congress, January 1947 to January 1949, had left the ground forces with only 10 Army and 2 Marine Corps divisions, all seriously undermanned. The 4 occupation divisions in the Far East, which had to respond to the Korean attack, had a total of only 25 infantry battalions instead of the 36 allotted. These and other units had to be brought up to strength by calling up reservists. Nevertheless, 1 division from Japan reached Korea by July 9th, a second by July 12th, and a third on July 18th. The intervention of American forces in Korea was undoubtedly a great shock to the Communists, especially as the North Korean attack was a Soviet operation, while the American landing directly threatened the security of Red China. Coordination between the 2 communist powers was far from perfect and was certainly slow. The Red Chinese had no desire to see American forces re-established on the Asiatic mainland or in occupation of all Korea up to the Chinese boundary along the Yalu River. On the other hand, they had no desire to get into a war with the United States to prevent this undesired consequence of what was really a Moscow operation, especially as Soviet support was very remote, and the farther end of the long single-track railway across Siberia. Nevertheless, the Red Chinese suspended their attack on Formosa and, in the course of July, assembled several 100,000 troops in northeast China, considerably withdrawn from the Yalu. For weeks, the successful advance of the North Koreans gave the Chinese hope that they need do nothing. The South Koreans were quickly hurled down to the southeastern corner of the country at Pusan, and for several weeks were on the verge of being pushed into the sea. Their line held, however, and American forces began to assemble in the protected beachhead. The United States was as eager as the Chinese to avoid a direct clash between the 2 countries because such a clash could easily build up into a major war in the Far East, leaving Russia free to do its will in Europe. Washington was fearful that Chiang Kai-shek, since he could not reconquer China himself and hoped America would do it for him, might seek to precipitate such a war by making an attack from Formosa on mainland China. There was also a strong chance that MacArthur might encourage or allow Chiang to do so because that haughty general agreed with Chiang that Europe was of no importance and that the Far East should be the primary, almost the only area of operations for American foreign policy. He had bitterly opposed the Germany First strategy throughout World War II and had begrudged men or supplies sent there on the grounds that these diversions delayed his triumphant return to the Philippines. As the war drew to its close, he had said, "Europe is a dying system. It is worn out and run down and will become an economic and industrial hegemony of the Soviet Union. The lands touching the Pacific with their billions of inhabitants will determine the course of history for the next 10,000 years." Damn, he sold out Europe pretty hard. These views were shared by the right-wing isolationist groups of the Republican Party with whom MacArthur had been in close touch for much of his life and to whom he owed some of his success. In American politics, these groups had power to do considerable damage because of their influence on the Republican Congressional Party and the fact that the bipartisan foreign policy under Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, which operated elsewhere in the world, did not exist in regard to the Far East. The danger of any Chang-MacArthur cooperation to build the Korean action up into a major war was intensified by the fact that this would be opposed by the United Nations and by our allies, neither of whom was considered important by the neo-isolationists or by MacArthur, but whom the Truman administration refused to alienate unnecessarily because they were essential as bases in the containment of Russia. In the first 2 weeks of August, another American division and parts of other units, including a Marine Corps brigade, landed at Pusan. By the middle of the month, that enclave was entrenched, and the counteroffensive to drive the North Korean forces back to the 38th parallel was being prepared. At that point, MacArthur made a brilliant suggestion. To avoid the hard push up the peninsula, he proposed landing 2 American divisions at Incheon, halfway up the west side of Korea, 50 miles south of the 38th parallel and only 25 miles from Seoul, the capital. Everything was adverse to this plan, unless there was a complete tactical surprise. Fortunately, this was achieved, a rather unexpected event in the east. Marine units landed at Incheon from the sea on September 15th and found little opposition. On September 22nd, they captured Seoul, and 6 days later were joined by the main United Nations offensive driving up the peninsula from Pusan. About half the PRK forces were captured in the bag, while the rest fled northward across the 38th parallel into North Korea. That frontier was reached by the UN forces as the month ended. The Red Chinese decision to intervene in North Korea was made about the 3rd week in August and began on October 15th, 9 days after American troops crossed into the 38th parallel into the North Korea. Such an intervention was almost inevitable, as Red China could hardly be expected to allow the buffer North Korean state to be destroyed and American troops to occupy the line of the Yalu without taking some steps to protect its own security. China would have welcomed the restoration of the boundary along the 38th parallel, which Russia had so carelessly destroyed by instigating the PRK attack in June. By October, they feared that the United States was about to use the Korean area as a base for a general war on China. In such a war, the Chinese expected to become the target of A-bombs, but believed that they could survive if they could wipe out the United Nations Korean base for ground operations. Accordingly, as soon as it became clear that American forces would continue past the 38th parallel to Yalu, the Chinese intervened, not to restore the 38th parallel frontier, but to clear the United Nations forces from Asia completely. The Chinese intervention in Korea, which began on October 15, 1950, was a much greater surprise than Incheon, and gave rise to one of the most bitter controversies in American political history, the so-called Truman-MacArthur controversy. The dispute arose from the fact that MacArthur did not accept his government's strategic and political plans and systematically sought to undermine and redirect them, while in constant communication with the press and with the leaders of the opposition political party for this purpose. The Truman administration, after the victory at Incheon, did not intend to stop at the 38th parallel and hoped to reunite the country under the Seoul government. It is probable that this alone triggered the Chinese intervention, but to reduce that possibility, Washington set certain restrictions on MacArthur's actions, which he soon sought to evade. Washington and Tokyo both knew that the Chinese had about 300,000 troops ready for action in Manchuria north of the Yalu, and that neither Russia nor China was attempting to re-equip the shattered North Korean forces. To discourage any Chinese intervention, the White House forbade any attack by Chiang on the Chinese coast, any naval blockade of China itself. Korea, of course, was blockaded, or any attack on China or Siberia north of the Yalu, or the use of non-Korean troops in the immediate vicinity of the Yalu as the conquest of North Korea was completed. On October 9, 1950, two of MacArthur's planes attacked a Russian air base 62 miles inside Russian territory and only 18 miles from Vladivostok. To make certain that MacArthur understood the reasons for these restrictions, President Truman the next day instructed MacArthur to meet him at Wake Island on October 15th. The two leaders had a lengthy discussion in which these restrictions were reiterated, but within 2 months of his return to Japan, MacArthur recommended his almost daily interviews and letters agitating against these limits. MacArthur recommenced his almost daily interviews and letters agitating against these limits. At Wake Island, General MacArthur assured President Truman that any Chinese intervention into Korea would be most unlikely and, in any case, would be on the scale which could be handled. Even as he spoke, the first Chinese units were already crossing the Yalu River from Manchuria into North Korea. These engaged in combat on October 26th and October 30th. Some had been captured. MacArthur continued to deny that any significant Chinese intervention was present or likely and tried to discourage it by a vigorous attack northward against the North Korean remnants. Because of lack of American troops for an attack across the width of the peninsula, he divided his forces into two separate attacks on either side of the peninsula, with no direct liaison between the two, where a considerable gap was left. Moreover, MacArthur on October 24th canceled the restrictions on the use of non-Korean forces close to the Chinese and Russian borders. His special communique of November 5th, which opened his northward offensive, spoke of it as one would, for all practical purposes, end the war and bring the United Nations forces home by Christmas. Until November 26th, the MacArthur offensive rolled northward against only moderate resistance, but just as it reached the Yalu frontier, at some points a gigantic Chinese offensive of 33 divisions counterattacked into the gap between the two UN wings. MacArthur's communique of November 28th spoke of the Chinese attack as a new war, which had shattered the high hopes we entertained that the intervention of the Chinese was only of a token nature on a volunteer and individual basis. At once, he began an intensive propaganda campaign both to obtain his earlier aims for direct attacks on coastal China and air attacks on interior points, and to rewrite the history of the preceding month so that his own actions would seem to be premeditated and skilled riposte to Chinese plans. In fact, his public statement of November 28th was in sharp contrast with his private message to Washington almost 4 weeks earlier, which estimated the Chinese forces across the Yalu as 500,000 men in 56 regular army divisions supported by 370,000 district security forces. In the face of such knowledge, no excuse can be found for MacArthur's use of a divided command with a central gap to attack towards such a force. The Chinese attack in MacArthur's mind reduced the American situation in the Far East to a simple choice between two extreme alternatives: either all-out war on China and possibly Russia to destroy world communism once and for all, or the immediate evacuation of our forces from Korea. The former would have given the Soviet Union a free hand in Europe. The latter would have made it impossible for us to obtain resistance against communist nibbling from any small states or even from our greater allies elsewhere in the world, and would have destroyed our prestige in Asia and Africa. A rapid visit by Generals J. Lawton Collins and Hoyt S. Vandenberg to Korea in January 12th through the 17th, 1951, convinced them that the middle alternative, which was still Washington's policy, namely to maintain the independence of South Korea, was still possible. Rather than accept this alternative, MacArthur intensified his press barrage against the administration, as well as his numerous messages to isolationist Republican politicians in Washington. A directive of December 6th, which ordered him to clear his public statements on foreign and military policy with the respective departments, was violated for some months with impunity. The congressional elections of 1950 had been disastrous to administration supporters and had been successful for isolationists of both parties, with the administration's majority in both houses cut almost to nothing. Senator Taft, now unchallenged leader of the isolationist bloc, argued that Governor Dewey's internationalist approach had lost the presidential election of 1948, and that his own wholesale opposition to the administration on an isolationist basis had been victorious in 1950 and would win the presidency, apparently for himself, in 1952. On this basis, a powerful attack was built up against Secretary of State Aikson, against NATO and other American commitments in Europe, and against foreign aid or any efforts to extend America's ground forces. Truman's efforts to send 4 divisions to Europe and to make General Eisenhower Supreme Commander of NATO were violently opposed by Taft, who had voted against ratification of NATO, and by Senator Weary, the Republican floor leader. Every effort was made to reduce the defense of the United States to a simpler matter of control of the air and the oceans without need for overseas forces or overseas allies. All this, of course, was simply a refusal to face 20th century conditions by men with 19th century ideas, and gave great support to MacArthur's insubordination. This insubordination and the general's alliance with the Republican opposition in the Congress was brought to a head on April 5, 1951, when the House Republican leader, Joseph Martin, read to the Congress a letter from MacArthur, which was a broad-gauged propagandist attack on the Truman administration's policies in the Far East. Truman used this as an excuse to remove MacArthur, although his real reason was the general sabotage of American and British efforts to negotiate an end of the war along the 38th parallel. 5 days after the MacArthur-Martin letter had been read in Congress, Truman removed the general from all his commands in the Far East. This was used by the isolationist opposition for a great triumphal homecoming for MacArthur. The Republican leaders spoke publicly of impeaching the president. Senator Nixon wanted congressional censure of the president and restoration of MacArthur to his commands, since his removal was appeasement of world communism. McCarthy said the president had made the decision while he was drunk, while Senator William Jenner said from the Senate floor, "This country today is in the hands of a secret inner coterie which is directed by the agents of the Soviet Union. We must cut this whole cancerous conspiracy out of our government at once. Our only choice is to impeach President Truman and find out who is the secret invisible government which has so cleverly led our country down the road to destruction. I think we know who the secret government really is. Sentiments similar to these were frequent both in public and in private for the next few years. MacArthur's return to the United States after an absence of almost 15 years was built up into an amazing display of popular hysteria. On landing at San Francisco, he was greeted by 500,000 people in one of the greatest traffic jams in the city's history. At Washington's airport, after midnight on April 19th, the crowds broke out of control. That afternoon, before a joint session of Congress and over a nationwide television broadcast, he made a speech which ranged from old-fashioned eloquence to pure ham. It ended on pathos. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away, and like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. This was followed by a parade in Washington before 250,000 spectators, but the real climax was reached in New York the following day when, for 6.5 hours, more than 7 million people spread over a 19-mile parade route cheered themselves hoarse over the general. This was twice the crowd that Eisenhower had seen. This was twice the crowd which had seen Eisenhower's return from Europe after the defeat of Germany in 1945. The general did not fade away immediately. By May, he was back in Washington as star witness for the prosecution in a congressional investigation into the country's Far East policies. Only an infinitesimal fraction of those who had cheered the general so heartily 2 weeks before paid any attention to the hearings. This was unfortunate. MacArthur seriously maintained that his policies could lead to the total defeat of Communist China without any increase in ground forces, simply by naval and economic blockade of China, by air attack on Chinese industry, and by lifting the wraps off Chiang Kai-shek. On this basis, he promised immediate victory with a minimum risk and casualties. The administration's policy, he insisted, was not victory, but to go on indecisively fighting with no mission for the troops except to resist and fight. A continued and indefinite extension of bloodshed. Okay, so they were trying to do the endless war thing even back then. Subsequent testimony from others, including the country's leading military experts and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, showed the unsubstantial nature of this vision of utopia. They rejected MacArthur's ideas as unrealistic and impossible. The bombing of Manchuria alone would take twice as many bombers as SAC had available. Bombing of Chinese industry would not deprive the Chinese of military supplies, as their arsenals were in the Soviet Union. An economic and naval blockade could not seriously injure a country as self-sufficient as China, with an open land frontier, and could not be effective at all unless military combat on the ground increased consumption rates. Efforts to adopt these policies would alienate the United States from its allies and the United Nations and would jeopardize the whole anti-Soviet position in Europe. Alright, I think I'm just going to stop there. How much more do we got? This Cold War thing is pretty much the end of the book. Okay, so we got the Cold War. It's like another 100 pages of the Cold War. And then this new era chapter. There's a new era chapter and then a future in perspective. Alright. So it looks like we got like 3 more chapters left. Now, this whole stuff with the nuclear bomb and the U bomb, it's kind of interesting. I mean, you can see that Russia was definitely ahead of us with the H bomb, I guess you can call it. And it was similar with the space race too. They were kind of ahead of us for a while, and then that kind of gave us a boost to like go ahead of them. Now, the Korean War thing, it's kind of like it was obviously that it was a proxy war. Again, these are all like you can see after they invented the H bomb, the A bomb, whatever, then they had to move into this proxy war thing where they can't directly attack a nuclear power, but what they do is they have a war in a periphery country using the weapons from each country. Like the United States uses M16s and the Russians use AK-47s, and then they give them to the North Koreans, they give them to the South Koreans, they have them fight each other, and then we send back up like right when they're about to win, so it doesn't look like we started the war. And while it is true that China did try to take over, I mean, obviously, after World War II, you can see why China became extremely aggressive towards the rest of the world, and then they took on the whole communism thing. But you could see the left-wing people in America, even going back to the 1950s, were kind of in support of communism. It wasn't like their biggest threat, at least. Like communist China wasn't the biggest threat of the left wing in America. They kind of saw possibly even Europe and Russia as a bigger threat, which is very similar to how it is today. So we can see that North Korea was basically established by the Soviets, Russians, and then backed up by the Chinese. And that's pretty much how it is right now, too. It's kind of a periphery state, a proxy state of the communists. And South Korea, I really wish them luck because I don't know what's happening with China nowadays. So we'll continue that chapter tomorrow, hopefully. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.